So Publius, we had an earlier call today about, it was a development call or a dev call. And Bacchus asked a question there that we said that we'll take it in class. And I was thinking that maybe this could be the topic of discussion, or we can talk a little bit more about it. So I'm just going to copy the guy already linked it or linked to it in the town hall chat. I'm just going to copy it so it's easier to read. All right. So, and maybe before taking the question, we can take it a step back and just set the scene on, what do we mean, or what do we imagine or think when we're talking about forks. So in one of the governance calls, we discussed a little bit on, what a fork may be, and maybe what is the advantage of having a fork, or why would...
Todd, maybe you want to just read out the question for those that are just listening.
Yes. So the question basically talks about fork. Let's say that a fork would happen, or Beanstalk will fork. Bacchus' question is, what would that mean for pod holders, Fert holders, and third-party protocols that basically use Beanstalk? So maybe before answering this specific question, Publius, I was asking if you can maybe summarize and tell us why would we end up in such a scenario? What would happen, or what is the scenario that we envision in which a fork happens? And then maybe we can answer this question and say what happens to pod Fert holders or the Beanstalk participants.
So one of the facts of operating in an open source environment is that in practice, anyone can take your ideas and your implementations and create copies. And there is some aspect of survival of the fittest that is core to the environment that Beanstalk operates in. And to some extent, that applies both from an economics perspective as well as a technology perspective, that the nature of money as well as the nature of open source technology makes it such that the environment Beanstalk exists in is as competitive as it gets. Now, if we assume that Beanstalk is somewhat successful, and you can define success as where it already is or some point in the future, it is entirely unrealistic to expect there do not be copies of Beanstalk or systems very similar to Beanstalk that ultimately arise to try to compete with it. And the competition is perfectly healthy, in our opinion. But with that said, there is some aspect of the system being designed to succeed in the highest chance possible, to give it the highest probability distribution of success when you consider all of the potential scenarios that it may find itself in, that it is the scenarios in which Beanstalk has to compete with forks is almost certainly a reality that it will face if it continues to be successful. And then the question becomes how the system can best prepare itself for that environment such that it is most likely to succeed in perpetuity. That's the starting point. Now, the reason why there has been, at least on our part, some discussion about forks is within the context of governance of Beanstalk. Ultimately, the question as to whether or not to propose to change Beanstalk through a BIP or create some sort of copy of Beanstalk or an explicit fork is fundamentally a governance question. And therefore, at least from our perspective, the discussion around how Beanstalk itself should deal with forks has to be taken in the context of the system of governance that is being implemented. So it's both an economics question and a governance question in practice for Beanstalk. But forks in general are something that the open source environment effectively mandates in practice, And at least, from our perspective, there has been some conversation around forks of Beanstalk springing up because of dissatisfaction with the current implementation or its growth thereof. And therefore, it probably is really healthy for the conversation around how Beanstalk should operate, assuming that there are forks, to happen sooner rather than later. Now, in practice, the implementation of a system that could enforce somewhat autonomously or entirely autonomously whatever forking protocol makes sense in theory it is going to be significant. It's going to take a while. And so to some extent, we may be getting ahead of ourselves to try to think that this is a problem that can be solved in short order, but at least it's a topic that hasn't been discussed much to date, at least to our knowledge. And it seems like given all of the questions around funding of Beanstalk Farms and the right way to govern the system, and as well as just the general environment that Beanstalk finds itself in, it's not a bad time to have the discussion. Although, to be totally honest, haven't dug into it to the point where we feel like we have resolution. So we'll be thinking through a lot of this out loud, right now.
Great, and maybe this could be, a first discussion, or maybe it's not even the first, a discussion of many, and others, who are with us today or later can always join as it matures, or as the conversation matures. Publius, before, or you've described it before as, let's say, a peaceful transition and maybe one that is not peaceful. Can you maybe explain what you meant by that, and what is a peaceful transition in a fork?
So what we meant by that was that there is some ability to exit the system freely, and from an ethos perspective, the idea is that anyone should have the ability to leave the system as they choose. Now, currently, the way that you can leave the system is by selling your beans, which is perfectly reasonable. Now, from the perspective of Beanstalk in particular, if there is going to be a fork where a significant amount of demand for beans leaves the system, it's certainly worth considering whether or not it's in the interest of Beanstalk to allow people to or encourage the fork by lowering the friction associated with something like this, for the fork to port over as much of the Beanstalk state as it would like, such that people opt, instead of selling their beans from the original version and buying the beans in the fork version, to burn their beans in the current version and mint beans in the new version. That would be, at the margin, the only real reason for Beanstalk to implement some sort of forking protocol natively. And it is worth thinking through a little bit whether or not in practice that would be the case. But if we grant that it is the case, that some people, I guess the fundamental question is there ever an instance where the fork of Beanstalk would want to honor the old Beanstalk state in any capacity, and as opposed to spinning up from scratch? And if that is the case, if there does seem to be some economic incentive fundamentally for a fork of Beanstalk, instead of spinning up from scratch, to migrate some portion of the or maybe all, but at least some portion of the state of Beanstalk in terms of outstanding beans, pods, and fertilizer, that if there is some incentive for that new implementation of Beanstalk to honor that old state, and I guess additionally would be the stock, the grown stock in particular, that if that's the case, it may be in the interest of the old version of Beanstalk to make it as easy as possible for the fork to honor as much of that old state as possible. And there are a couple reasons for that. One would be, I guess the first reason that we already mentioned would be the burning of beans to mint them on the new chain. Presumably, you'd really be burning deposits to mint deposits on the new implementation of Beanstalk, not necessarily a new chain per se. But the other way where there's potentially some indirect benefit to Beanstalk would be that if the likelihood that a fork honors the debt of the current version of Beanstalk, pods, and fertilizer, that may increase the value of pods and fertilizer. And that is inherently beneficial to Beanstalk. So there is some indirect benefit and then some more direct benefit, where instead of having the beans sold on the market and then needing to either borrow or through convert return the price to the peg, by making it potentially seamless for people to burn their deposits on one version of Beanstalk to mint them on another, the system could dramatically decrease potentially the sell pressure associated with competitive versions of Beanstalk.
Okay. I have a few follow-up questions on that, but we'll read one of maybe the comments from Jams, and they're asking if we're thinking about forking and who will initiate that fork. And then what's the difference between the OG Beanstalk and the forked Beanstalk? I think the last question is probably what we're discussing. But are we thinking about forking, and who is initiating the fork? This is just, talks in general. Nothing concrete is happening now, and as Publius covered it maybe earlier, and you can maybe share some more thoughts, Publius, is that we're having a discussion that maybe we think hasn't been discussed, yet, and you can think of it more as being prepared. Okay, Publius.
Yeah, I want to just explicitly say that we, Publius, have no intention of forking Beanstalk. However, people have come to us and talked about forking Beanstalk, and therefore do feel like it's a relevant topic to be discussing. And furthermore, the real, separate from the fact that people may fork Beanstalk, as has always been the case. I think there was actually one fork. I don't even remember what it was. I think it was corn themed a while back. Could be mistaken on that. But the other thing is, there is an active conversation happening around governance and trying to figure out a permanent system of on-chain governance that Beanstalk can survive with in perpetuity, and fundamentally feel like forking it has to be considered in the context of on-chain autonomous governance. So the question is whether or not Beanstalk, from a governance perspective, should welcome forks because of the potential benefit to Beanstalk, or whether it should maximize the friction around forks to prioritize its current network effect. And that's a debate worth having around what would be the marginal benefit to Beanstalk of facilitating something like this. It probably also has to be had in the context of whether or not the debt, meaning the pods and the fertilizer, would be honored by the fork. From our perspective, feel like it's almost impossible for the network effect of Beanstalk to be copied or duplicated without honoring the debt, because the debt is as a credit-based system, the current debt and the ability to repay the debt is fundamentally where the value of the system derives. And so the honoring of the outstanding debt of Beanstalk seems to be almost necessary in order to take over the network effect of Beanstalk, particularly at scale. At the current stage, that's more questionable. But the bigger point is that these are just fundamental questions that need to be asked and answered as we are constructing a governance system.
Yes, agreed. And I see some of the comments that are, maybe shying away or prefer not to have the forking or the fork discussion. But I think all discussions are eventually positive. Maybe talking more in depth about it clears up or explains reasons on why not to do such a thing, or maybe even why to do it if it's a good thing, and then how to do it. Okay, Publius, I want to go back to the example then that maybe we started with.
To some extent, just want to say, sort of agree with Harry that this is probably not the most constructive thing to be talking about at the margin, but people have questions, and fundamentally we feel like class is a place where anytime that there are questions, it's important to address them. Last time we mentioned the forks in the context of the governance discussion. Perhaps that was a mistake too, but only if you think that this is not something that needs to be answered in the medium term, let's call it. And while there has been some productive discussion to fix or improve the governance situation in the short term, hard to think that this isn't a very relevant piece of the puzzle. And we're not going to shy away from talking about anything that we feel is important for a final autonomous version of Beanstalk to exist. Recognize that from a strategic perspective, talking about forks may make forks more likely, but at the end of the day, at least from our perspective, forks have always been something that are expected, and it's really about how the system would operate in a competitive environment. And to shy away from those types of questions is probably not optimizing over a long time horizon. The system ultimately really does need to be competitive in all situations. So recognize talking about this stuff may make people a little uncomfortable, particularly if you're thinking about, we're going to go fork the protocol. Again, we have no intention to do that at all at the moment, and feel like honoring all of the current, again, debt of the system is sort of fundamental to the nature of the system, and to create a new Beanstalk would be totally against the point. And from that perspective, and honestly, this is actually maybe a good point to make. From the perspective of if the system is going to honor all of the outstanding debt of the system, what does it actually mean to be a fork, right? It's a copy of the software of the system with some alterations, but fundamentally the previous state of the system is somewhat being honored. And so if we talk about this from a theoretical perspective, particularly in the context of the environment that Beanstalk exists in, like a chain, you have a hard fork and a soft fork, where the hard fork effectively makes it such that the new version of the software is not backwards compatible with the old version of the software, but the state of the system is still retained. And whereas in a soft fork, the old version of the software is still valid. An old. Yeah, I think that's a decent way to put it. Probably not the best, but the concept is that when you have the system go into a hard fork, you have a bifurcation in the future state of the network. Whereas when it's a soft fork, there is no duplication or separation of the state of the network. There's just two separate versions of the software that may be coming to consensus on the same thing. And this is fundamentally the difference between the way that BIPs currently work in Beanstalk, which are all in practice soft forks, with something that would more closely resemble a hard fork, where there's some honoring of anyone can obviously just copy Beanstalk and deploy it from scratch. But what we're really talking about here is the honoring of pods and fertilizer, and at least in some capacity, maybe according to some multiplier, plus or minus. It could be a bonus to encourage people to come to the new system, or it could be cutting the debt in some capacity. But there's an honoring of the previous state of the system. And then there's a question of, if you think about the depositors in the silo, the holders of the value in the system, as somewhat the validators of the network, in the context of network forks, then there's a question as to making it such that the depositors, where the liquid value of the system comes from, can just migrate through the two different versions of the system. That's probably what the most competitive, low friction version of the system would look like. And the implications of something like this are pretty meaningful in the context of, at the moment, if you think about what happened with the merge, and we've spoken about this before, in practice, all of the decision around which chain to honor came down to very few centralized participants in the system, who are the issuers of the stable coins on the chain. And they have in practice, the ability to decide which chain is valid, because the majority of value on the chain, other than Ether itself, is coming from centralized issuers, and they can only honor a single version of the stable coin. So they basically have to choose, or they could create some sort of system where they could honor both chains, but people have to in advance opt into a chain. So there's some ability to opt into the new chain in advance, or into the old chain in advance. And that's in practice what we're talking about implementing here. And so you can really think about this as, from a forking perspective, a larger problem than just Beanstalk. It's a problem that extends to the network layer. And this is the type of solution, because Beanstalk is in the same position. It really doesn't make sense for a fork to just duplicate the entire state, including the liquid beans, because you can't really double the supply of money and expect both of them to retain value. So you have to cut. You at least in theory, you wouldn't expect to be able to just double the supply of money and maintain the price of both monies. So there's some question of making it as easy as possible to opt into the new or old system in as low friction as possible. And that type of model could extend to, again, not just Beanstalk, but to governance at the chain layer as well, or the network layer.
Yeah, I think this is maybe a side comment, but typically one of, when you're talking about non-collateralized stablecoins, or algo stablecoins, the argument is always, why this wouldn't work is that if I just fork it, I will double the amount of money. without, of course, here we're talking about why that's not the case. Okay, Publius, want to go back to the example of, let's say there's a fork right now, and then for old and for now, let's only talk about stockholders, since that's easier for them to exit and enter the system versus pod or Fert holders. One way for you to go to the new fork, let's say, is that you exit the silo, you sell all your beans or whatever it is that you have, and then you enter that new fork. And then another way, and then maybe this is what we described as peaceful, is that there is some sort of an agreement between the status quo or the original protocol, and then you can just switch to the newer one or to the newer fork. Is that correct so far? In the scenario that you're thinking of?
Correct.
Okay.
So it's either selling, or the peaceful option is to have some sort of opt-in. Correct.
Okay. Do you think, what reasons do you think, or can you think of, why would anyone, first of all, maybe why would the new system want to accept all debt or all pod holders, and then the similar on why would the older ones also want to move? Do you see any advantages in doing that?
Well, the system would want to honor the debt of the new system. One would think would want to honor the debt of the old system, because that is fundamentally where the network effect comes from. And in practice, what would it mean to be a better implementation of Beanstalk? It's a better capacity to pay off debt. And so the concept of honoring the old debt is sort of the way to take full advantage of the current network effect of the protocol, or a significant amount of it, and demonstrate efficacy in excess of the old version, if that makes sense. Now, there's some argument to be made that just the growth of the new system could cause there to be a strong enough network effect in excess of the old system, but there's a question as to whether or not that new network effect is as strong or sustainable as the old network effect. These are things that sort of fundamentally are likely to play out in the market.
Yeah, I think you raise very interesting points, especially that this is a credit-based system. So, if you create a fork and you just let go of all of your previous debt and expect, people to move into there, then what will, why would new creditors, trust you, if that makes sense? You can just fork again and then move on.
Exactly. And why would one of the holders of the system want to move over? So I think that this question best applies to depositors. The short answer is that there is probably some benefit. Well, there's certainly some benefit if the new version of the system is willing to honor the grown stock. So you're basically burning old deposits, and then you get these new deposits, and there's no opportunity cost there to migrating over. That's probably some marginal benefit, but to some extent, if you're gonna buy into the new system, you do want to buy into the new system with it as small as possible. But the issue is around dilution, where at the individual level, if you're a participant in the new system, you want to get as big a chunk of it as possible before you get diluted from the system getting paid back. But it ultimately makes it such that the system is likely to overheat, right? So if you start at zero and everyone's now rushing in to a very small door, it's much less likely to be a sustainable growth than if you start with a slightly bigger pot and grow from there. So again, it's a question of Beanstalk in many ways solves tragedy of the commons problems, and there is some sort of question as to whether or not the tragedy of the commons in this case would make it such that the protocol overheats, despite honoring all of the old debt. Probably unclear how that would work out in practice, but certainly from the perspective of the old Beanstalk, it is in its interest to have people burn their deposits for new deposits in order to minimize sell pressure, certainly. From the perspective of the new Beanstalk, it's less clear what is the benefit in terms of the network effect and the likely volatility in the price around having the ability to migrate deposits. But certainly there's some benefit to Beanstalk. And again, this is one of the fundamental questions that we asked at some point earlier in the discussion, which would have to be answered in the affirmative in order for it to make sense for some sort of forking protocol to be implemented. And at this point, don't feel like it's clear that there is a benefit to the new protocol to honoring the grown stock at the margin. It may be, but it also may not be. And therefore, there's an argument to be made that it's not worth it to implement some sort of native forking protocol because, again, the only place where this really makes a difference is on the silo side of things. It's relatively simple to honor the state of the debt. The more difficult part is around facilitating the migration of the deposits. So, yeah, it's a interesting open questions here.
Yeah, I would think that there will still be some sort of maybe resistance to old, let's say, stockholders moving to the new one if they were going to lose, their grown stock, or at least it will introduce some, some thought there. And I would imagine it would be easier to, migrate older ones or older stockholders by honoring some sort of, will maintain that stock, given that you've been there, or if you want to do that switch. But anyways, all of this is not, and maybe no one, the new participants don't care, or this is something that they don't value. Publius wanted to expand a little bit more on this now, and bring it from a governance point of view. And I want to think about this if this maybe the idea of forking is not negative in general, and it could be maybe even a point of strength for Beanstalk. So one of the reasons, and maybe one of the main reasons why forking happens, it's not the only one, and maybe it's not the main one, but I would say it's one of the main ones, is that there is a disagreement in governance. People want to go different directions, and hence you get a fork, at which each fork thinks that they will run or manage that fork in a better way. If Beanstalk does implement this peaceful transition way, in a sense that any fork can happen, and then participants can switch and migrate between one fork to another. And in the example that we gave when it comes to like stockholders, you can anyways do that. You don't really need that peaceful transition. There are advantages to it, but anyways, you can exit, sell the system and then enter the system. So you have that ability to do it. If the forks are, peaceful to each other, where one person can switch from one to another, doesn't that more or less contain all of the forks' value into one big, Beanstalk ecosystem? So it doesn't really matter where are you. It does matter to an extent, but still the total Beanstalk value will be the total value of all of these forks, just given that they are all, they can move from one to another.
Well, there is a network effect here such that it's unlikely that there are a bunch of different Beanstalks all issuing the same assets. You could make an argument that the market may prefer to have different Beanstalks issuing different assets of different denominations, as opposed to a single Beanstalk issuing assets of different denominations. We would probably disagree with that idea and think that the network effect around credit is pretty strong, such that it's better to have a single system that socially everyone opts into. But the market may decide it's better to have competing credits or systems of credit. And from that perspective, you could make an argument that it's all the Beanstalk ecosystem, and therefore it's beneficial to who is, I guess, the question. And from the perspective of a pod holder or a Fert holder or a stockholder, the real question as to who it's beneficial to is around financial value. And the key here is around creating a system that is most likely to remain credit worthy, right? Beanstalk is a credit-based system. And so the fundamental question is around creating a system that is likely to remain credit worthy. And from that perspective, if you consider that the market is at least going to test out a variety of different competing versions of the system, there's certainly an argument to be made that the system should be optimized around planning for that. Now, another aspect of this discussion, which we haven't really spoken about or considered thus far, is if the underlying network itself forks. So let's say that there are two versions of Ethereum that now exist. There is an open question as to how Beanstalk should operate such that there is not a fork in the network effect of Beanstalk as an issuer of money. Or a sister question to this is how Beanstalk should operate in a multi-chain environment where the network effect around Beanstalk remains in place. And so, this is a very layered, sophisticated question that is not going to be answered so simply. But to neglect the question would be a total mistake.
Okay. We'll take a question from Syncubate. And their discussion or their question is regarding governance, mainly on maybe voter participation, and they highlighted how some stockholders have grown stock, and that they're not like active or participating. And then they're thinking, or their question now, and maybe I'll try to read it so that I don't missummarize it. So in the context of recent governance discussions and considering Beanstalk is now 6 months post-replant, would it not be helpful for the DAO to start to reflect on how much of an advantage Unripe assets have in terms of both vesting and governance power plus seniorage, and how that may very well impede the appeal of the protocol to new LPs in the silo? So they then continue on saying that instead of a fork, why not require Unripe asset holders to opt into either taking vesting but forsaking their stock and seats, or retaining their stock and seats to keep their governance power plus claim seniorage but give up their claim to vesting? What are your thoughts, Publius?
So this is exactly where, at the margin, if Beanstalk had Sync says instead of a fork, this is why a forking system may make the most sense, because you can now deploy a fork of Beanstalk where all the unripe and ripe asset holders can opt in. And so the system now moves over to this new rule base, and the unripe asset holders may not move over. Only the ripe asset holders may move over. All the debt is maintained. But the point is that if the thesis is correct, that the unripe asset holders are holding back the system, and because of the way that the system is currently structured, they have a significant hold over the governance of the system. So they're not going to opt-in. They're not going to vote with a majority for a rule change that diminishes their ability to control the system. They have it captured, and therefore the system is stuck. This type of forking mechanism is exactly what would allow for the minority of governance holders, but perhaps a significant amount of value holders in the system, to migrate over to a new version that they think would be competitive with the current version that they think is captured by the unripe asset holders. So this is, in practice, exactly why this type of discussion is important, because perhaps this is the way that it's most likely to have rigorous competition around the model itself, but the highest likelihood that participants in the system ultimately get paid.
Okay. And Publius, what are your thoughts in general? So now maybe you touched on why an advantage of having a fork could be, which is, to do this and then test it out and see what the market wants. But what are your thoughts in general on, unripe asset holders and the stock that they currently have / the vesting and maybe the seniors that they get? So stockholders, they succeeded in, or, they are running a fundraiser. They managed to, raise whatever amount that is currently raised. And it is this amount that is raised that's providing liquidity and it's providing, the price discovery for Bean is why they have, stock. And that is as a percentage or is, sized or scaled according to how much was raised. Do you think or see that there is anything unfair about, the current structure? And maybe also, what are your thoughts on it being inhibiting or impeding any new participants? Do you think that this is the case, that currently we are not getting new participants because of how much the older ones have accumulated?
So fair is not, at least from our perspective, in a free world where people can do whatever they want. Fair is probably not the right metric, and given that the participation in Beanstalk after the exploit was clearly defined, meaning the DAO is ultimately the thing that was borrowing the money, right? The protocol is governed by the DAO. The DAO approved the rules by which the protocol would borrow the money from the market, and so anyone that is lending to the system or then participating in the system after the system was replanted understands or certainly has all of the resources available to them to understand exactly what the rules of the system that they're opting into are. So that's fair, but don't think that beyond that it makes sense to make any sort of value judgments on the fairness of the rules of the system. Instead, want to talk about the second question, which is based on the rules of the system, what are the current incentive structures created, and how does that affect the system, and are they good or bad? There's an interesting point that Guy made recently, which is that the unripe asset holders are also owed by Beanstalk, similar to how Pod and Fert holders are owed by the system. And typically, or at least from a principal perspective, Beanstalk tries to make it such that only the value that can leave the system immediately is in charge of governance, because there's some aspect of being able to leave freely that makes you most likely to be a good governor of the system that you're a part of freely. Whereas if you are owed something by the system, your views on how the system should grow or change are somewhat corrupted. Now, think that this principle must apply here as well, and it's important to recognize that compared to the value that, based on the rules of the system, compared to the value that can be freely removed by depositors, compared to the value of the stock that they exercise in governance, is greatly disproportionate at the moment. And there is some incentive there that they get an outsized amount of voting power, such that they are encouraged to get themselves paid. Now, at this point, why not have the pod holders or the fertilizer holders participate in governance? So to some extent, I think there's a very valid argument that from a philosophical perspective, or a theoretical perspective, it doesn't bode well for Beanstalk that a group of stakeholders in the system that are owed by the system are hold such a significant portion in governance, or any portion of governance for that matter. And there's certainly an argument to be made that only the ripe asset holders should be able to, or not even the, I don't think it's the ripe assets. I think it's just the normal assets, according to the Beanstalk lexicon. It's just the normal assets. Bean 3 curve, the people that have deposited regular assets in the silo, those are the primary stakeholders in the system. There's certainly a valid argument to be made that that's a better system of governance. Don't know how true that would be in practice, given that effectively you have to assume that the participants that have come in after the exploit are largely new participants, and there is some question as to the DAO that got the system restarted continue to have a significant amount of influence on the system, as opposed to the DAO getting the system restarted and now immediately ceding all control of the system to the new members of the system. So from that perspective, feel like there is probably some sort of nice balance between the old DAO members and the new DAO members having joint control of the system. And at that point, once you grant that that's really the way that things need to be, then there's a question of, well, given that the current system does do that according to some rules, can those rules be improved? I'm sure they could be improved at the margin, but they probably do a pretty good job of aligning the incentives, and it's to some extent just a question of where in these arbitrarily defined curves we currently are at the moment, or where in the incentives created by the arbitrarily defined curves are we at the moment. So experiencing perhaps a little bit of inefficiency in the system itself, but it's hard to imagine it's a really significant marginal improvement that can be made around straddling the old DAO members and the new DAO members, because you just need to make some sort of decision around how to count their ownership of the system, how it contributes to governance, and no matter how you slice it, it's not going to be perfect. So at that point, it's like, well, how are you going to slice it? It was already decided how it was going to be sliced. To rejigger how it's going to be sliced is probably suboptimal, but or at least a suboptimal use of time, we should say.
And think if you had follow-up questions, you can type it, or feel free to join us on stage and you can continue this discussion. Otherwise, we'll move to the next question from Terboy. And Terboy asks, how are devs hired in an anonymous DAO environment? It appears there's a lot of interest in people working with Beanstalk, but how can one trust these people have the right intentions? Are audits the only way to catch bad dev actors? Publius, you can answer, and I see also maybe Cyber Chad is here. He can come on stage and share some of these or some of those thoughts.
Yeah, was going to ask if Chad wanted to come up here and give an answer. If not, we're happy to give an answer. But I feel like they're doing a lot of the hiring and also a lot of the communication with the auditors, and therefore they're probably a great person to answer this.
What's up, everybody? Great question, Turboy. So I think there's two components here. The first is on the hiring front and figuring out who we decide to collaborate with. And the second is around how are we verifying code before it goes out. So to speak to the first one, I think to zoom out a little bit, it's important to remember that everything that we're doing is open source. And so at the end of the day, anybody can come contribute to the code base, whether that's on the front end or on the subgraphs or even on the protocol. And I think, at the protocol level, there's a fairly clearly established process in terms of pushing code updates to the protocol, and that's the BIP process, which we'll probably continue updating. With respect to the rest of the stack, I think developing a process by which other developers can contribute to that code autonomously is something that we're looking towards. As it works right now, ultimately anybody can come submit a PR, and folks on the Beanstalk Farms team will take a look at that code and decide whether to merge it in. And we've actually had a number of contributors, including some folks who are here on the call tonight, who've just, we've found out about that way. But point being is that, with all of the code being open source, ultimately we invite a pretty wide range of people to come contribute. In terms of how we hire for Beanstalk Farms specifically, happy to address that. I think it's a little bit more nuanced, but ultimately we're interested in working with anybody who has worked in DeFi and wants to help build Beanstalk. And there's a whole lot of ways in which people can help in that regard. I think with respect to bad actors, so there's really a couple layers of protection here, and obviously always something in terms of security and other things that we want to keep a close eye on, but ultimately think we have a system that's in place now that puts a good number of protections on things. So at the first layer, when we're looking at upgrades that are going to happen, in particular to the protocol, we spend a decent amount of time as a team sort of bouncing ideas back and forth, and often reading over specifications before things begin development. So typically there is some shared understanding of how features and other things should be built before a developer starts writing code. I think the second sort of extending on that is that often developers will pair up to write code. So it's not, sometimes there are people who write things independently, at least the initial version, but very frequently we're collaborating. And so I think that reduces the potential surface area for problems. From there, once anything is completed, and it depends to some degree on what the code is affecting, but we do team code reviews. So particularly over the last couple of months, we've really started to hone our process in terms of, before any code even goes to an auditor, how do we share it amongst the team? What does a code review process look like? And I think, the conclusion we've kind of come to, particularly in the last couple of months, is that that process needs to be pretty detailed. And so, myself and Publius and Breen and other folks who have worked on the Solidity contract side have spent a lot of time reviewing each other's work and really getting into the weeds, and have found that even when, even for the best developers, it's good to have, input from other folks. And we find a lot of really interesting improvements that we can make during that process. And then I think finally, all code that hits that hits Beanstalk is audited by somebody, and sometimes by multiple people. When I say hits Beanstalk right now, I'm referring to specifically contract upgrades that go out in BIPs, and then also other components of the Beanstalk ecosystem that Beanstalk Farms develops, like wells, for example. And there may come a time down the road where we also do continuous audits on other pieces of the infrastructure, like the SDK and the UI, but right now focused on the Solidity side. And we work pretty closely with auditors to really get in the weeds on every level of the code. And a lot of that also comes down to the process of preparing documentation of how the code is expected to behave ahead of time, and then walking them through that. So I think I know it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think the combination of all of those things together gives like a pretty good coverage of making sure that good code makes it on chain.
We'll just add that in the context of building composable technology, that ultimately modifications and additions to what is being built are likely. And it's ultimately up to the users and the user interfaces to ensure that the versions of the contracts that they are using are safe. And from that perspective, there's not much more other than audits and potentially multiple audits that can make it really easy for users in particular to verify that whatever they're using is safe. And so, to some extent, at the end of the day, getting all of this code audited by one or more auditors is very important to creating an environment where users can verify for themselves, even if they're non-technical, that the code that they're interacting with or the contracts they're interacting with have been audited or are safe as they can check for themselves.
To add one more thing to that, this we'll talk more about this in the DAO meeting on Thursday, but Beanstalk Farms is working to engage additional auditors to help kind of give a spread of folks who are looking at Beanstalk, and we have a new auditor who's working on some code starting this week. So I think that's another way in which we're trying to keep more eyeballs on this thing and never have it be one individual who's shipping code.
Thank you, Chad and Publius. And maybe one thing to note on is that Beanstalk Farms is as doxed as it has been, since day one. It wasn't long ago when there were not only anons, but there was also voice moderators. So we've gone or moved a long way, or have come a long way since then. Okay.
The good old days.
Good old days and good present days, and to the future as well. We have a minute until Amen. We have a minute, or we can spend a few more minutes. Let's see if folks have any questions that they would like to ask before we end this class. All right. Thank you all for joining us today, and Publius, thank you for taking the time to have today's discussion. Chad, thank you for coming in, and to those who are joining us, if you have any questions on how can you contribute or add to the development of Beanstalk, you can reach out to Silo, Chad, or to Guy, who are with us here. Thank you all for joining us again, and we'll see you next week.